Hello, everyone. Thank you for checking out this episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I am here with.
Hi, folks. My name is Whitney Beltran, also known as Strix online, and I am the narrative director over at Hidden Path Entertainment, where we're currently making a AAA Dungeons and Dragons video game. I'm also an RPG creator. I co-wrote Bluebeard's Bride with two other really amazing women. And I've made my own mobile game as well with Aconite called Hollow Vista. Both Bluebeard's Bride and Hollow Vista are award-winning games, so definitely check them out. But I am also a games academic. I have a master's degree in mythology, where I studied the intersection of play and myth and psychology. So I've written peer-reviewed academic papers as well as a chapter in a textbook, and I have a new book that I'm working on right now. And I really love games, so I am happy to be here. Thanks, Manny.
Hi, I'm Ajit George. In my full-time job, I am the Director of Operations for the Shanti Bhavan Children's Project, a nonprofit based in India. But as a very active hobbyist, I am a writer and advocate in games. I sit on the Gen Con Guest of Honor Advisory Committee. I am also an advocate for the Nebula Awards for the game writing or the game writing awards section. I've written for a bunch of indie RPGs, and I'm also currently working on a unannounced D&D book.
Ooh, okay. I'll try not to ask questions about that.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about the new Ravenloft book. Now, both of you were contributors to this, and especially two specific domains. Forgive me if I mispronounce the names. Kalakeri and Niranjan. Am I close?
So Kalakeri and Niranjan I did, and then Valachan is what Strix did.
Oh, that's right. My apologies.
Right.
Let's first talk about the inspirations behind these.
So Kalakeri and Naranjan, the Ashwin of Naranjan, are both new, and those are interlinked together. And one's kind of more fleshed out in the book as a major domain, whereas the Ashwin of Naranjan is one of those teaser domains that sort of give you a little enough to like build something off and kind of give an inspiration, but allows the DM to create more from there.
And as far as Valachan goes, it's actually a very old setting with lots of history in Ravenloft. And the old Dark Lord was Von Karkov. And Von Karkov was deposed by our new Dark Lord, Chikuna. And, it presents a continuity of story, but the big change for Valachan is really identifying what relationship it has with real world cultures. And my inspiration was definitely Ecuador and the northern part of Peru, where I spent time as a Peace Corps volunteer in the early aughts. I'm also Mexican American. I have a lot of family down south, and capturing a more Southern experience, especially with the naming conventions and some of the values presented, was really great. It was fun.
If I may ask, I really love the story of how that came to be, how the Dark Lord, the current Dark Lord, took over it defeated the original one by taking out their heart, and it's such a great story. Where was there was there a specific story or mythology, anything like that helped you construct that? That was amazing.
Well, as I mentioned, I have a master's degree in mythology, so I've really trained in understanding kind of like most of the mythologies out there in the global world. But for me, Valachan has been historically thematically centered around colonialism and invasion, right? Von Karkov is subjugating these indigenous folks. And what I did is I thought, well, what happens next? If this is a horror setting and these people actually free themselves of him, is it so simple that everybody gets to just be happy again? And in my experiences with like growing up, as part of a line of very poor Mexican Americans is that trauma is intergenerational. People that have been very hurt by something can then turn around and be perpetrators. And so the whole idea was, what if they've finally done it? They've freed themselves of this colonial force. And now the tragedy of this is that they are perpetuating the harm cycles that it introduced. So Chacuna, in her own mind, and in the minds of her people, was a hero when she disposed of von Kharkov, when she beat him. But the price that she had to pay, eating his heart and literally ripping out her own and putting it on a pestle in a sacred temple, caused the cycle to keep going, right? And as players, the only way you can truly get rid of Chacuna and neutralize her is to take her heart and eat it and put your own on the pedestal. So it's really a metaphor and a meditation on how these harms are not simple, and these intergenerational problems are not simple. And sometimes the tragedy is that even if you've escaped like the physical environment of the harm that is being done, you haven't escaped the mental environment. So that's a lot of what's packed into Valachan today.
If I wanted to play the setting and try to flesh it out as much as I can, let's say with more maps or more instances, or maybe other side quests, maybe to lead before we lead into the main story of it. Is there anything you would recommend that we read or look into, and so that this is played properly?
Yeah. So first of all, you should know, everybody out there, that there's a lot of hints in the names of things. If you are familiar with some of the indigenous languages in that part of South America, or you can look them up, some really interesting things start to present themselves in the map and the ecology of Valachan, like, the Valley of Chattering Teeth, if you can discover where that is and why they're chattering, or Blood Island, right? These are very evocative names if you do a little bit of the treasure hunting work. In terms of like playing the setting well, my recommendation is actually not to read anything per se, but to accept or to lean into bad outcomes, tragic outcomes. D&D is really a setting of heroics, right? We want to win, we want to beat the bad guy. But if you really want to play Valachan as intended, you'll go all the way to the bitter end with that story arc, and you'll let players discover what's in their own darkest hearts, like what they're willing to do to survive and to depose Chacuna, like what atrocities will they commit to win. That's kind of the whole point.
Kalakeri, almost the same type of line of questioning. How were you inspired to create this exactly?
Yeah, so Kalakeri comes from a bunch of different things, but it started off with the genesis of Razia Sultana. And Razia Sultana was she was the Sultan of the Delhi Sultanate, and she was probably, as far as anybody knows, the first woman Muslim leader in the world. She reigned for 4 years. From the historical information that's available, she was actually quite a competent leader, but she was deposed, and if I recall, her brother took over, and she eventually was executed after a long struggle for the throne. And I just found her story very compelling and very powerful. But then from there, I moved on, and I took a little bit of inspiration from the Mughal Empire, and a lot from, in terms of geography, names, some of the cultural touchstones from South India, which is where I'm from and where I go and work for part of the year. So my goal was not to be like a one-for-one transplanting of India into D&D. I don't think that works very well. I think that kind of locks you in too tightly into one specific kind of inspiration. I was hoping to blend inspirations and then create something uniquely new, something that could live vibrantly in D&D. And I think, that was really sort of the goal with Kalakeri. And then the Ashwin of Naranjan is sort of an extension of that as well. So that was the root inspiration for Kalakeri.
there's also a sense of tragedy because it's family versus family. It's
Yeah.
and it's almost even though I definitely side with Vanya. You could tell that both forces, both factions, are pretty much destroying the world around them. That's sort of the tragedy behind it. Was that something? Am I getting the right vibe and feel for it?
Yeah, for sure. The three siblings. In a project like Ravenloft, there's so much material that needs to be put in, which means a lot of material that like you're developing and you've got in the back of your head, but you're not able to put on the paper. But the three siblings have a very complicated backstory in my mind, and kind of the notes I built out, and they're warring with each other and having this struggle, but doing so much damage to each other when. The ironic thing is they could have been wise rulers if they were only able to work together. And that was, one of the major strategies is no side is going to give in. They're always going to be battling and fighting with each other. And if you look at the domains, it ends up being that like probably, Rami as a Death Knight, and she's armed with these mystical weapons and so on and so forth. She's probably maybe stat wise, maybe the most deadly of the Dark Lords of Ravenloft. Her and Aslan, who's disappeared, and maybe Strahd, right? Those are the ones that are the top contenders. So you're not really intending to fight her. And if you were to fight her and defeat her, Arjani and Riva are pretty brutal too. You don't want them taking charge. So the players are theoretically put in this weird situation of these incredibly powerful forces. And much like Valachan, like you are the real struggle is not to like just maybe try to like fight one of them at the end of like a big boss battle. I don't think that's really what horror is about. Big boss battles are not. If you look at horror movies and the horror genre, horror is like this like monstrous force that you really can't defeat. It's usually tragic endings, and so in this one, it's a psychological battle, right? So you can try the best way to do it is to maybe try to play the factions off against each other, which is what the renown system was built for, and really also builds into a little bit of some Indian culture that it was kind of playing with, where if you're trying to get one side to join with you, well, that might help against the other side, but then what do you have to do to get that power? Like what sacrifices do you have to make? What kind of atrocities might you have to do? And the psychological warfare is really sort of like the psychological horror is that to survive in Kalakeri, you're doing horrible things yourself to combat horrors. And that, I think that's an interesting element that I really hoped, comes out.
Naranjan, almost the same question, because it's a very interesting story setting where it's almost like a vampire tale, but it's not a vampire. It's a crafty bronze dragon that's tricking people into some sort of a false enlightenment.
Yeah.
What did that come from?
So that originally all of this was one domain, and then I realized I just had too much material for one domain, so I split it off. The story of Sartak, which is the bronze dragon, is the renown system was something else. I called it the favor system originally. Wes as being the lead designer on it, and I decided we had to scale it back to the renown system, which was there was already rules for it because it got too complex. And so what it was originally was the favor system was a old, like almost a ritual or a custom within Kalakeri that if you were to do certain deeds to get someone else's favor, they would in turn be obligated to do what you've requested of them. And it was an interesting way. It's my kind of take on the caste system or the power inequality in India, and how people of lower power or lower social status have to do these things to gain power or gain respect of those of higher power. It also speaks to a lot of fables from India of the gods being petitioned by these elaborate rituals, and then they would grant incredible boons to the people who did these rituals. And I was like, wow, even enemies could do that. So in the Ramayana, Ravana being this Rakshasa who's very evil or bad, he gets the boons of the gods to give him enormous power. He's almost invincible because he's done these rituals for the gods. And I would look at this and I go, Ravana is a demon or a Rakshasa. Like, how are the gods giving him all this stuff? But he did all the proper rituals and all the proper procedures to win their favor. And that was really striking and interesting to me. And so what I created was something, the deeper move with the renown system was that you could get Ramya's favor by doing this. Like, you could do all these things for her, and then she would give you whatever you asked for, theoretically. And so Sartek was kind of tied into this. He, centuries ago had been won over by the founder of that dynasty. And in fact, the founder convinced him through all of these petitions and rituals to work to side with him. And Sartek swore to forever serve the line, that dynasty. And so he's bound up to the dynasty. And when the dynasty falls apart, Sartek is like, I think he's in hibernation, or he's sleeping for a while or whatever. So he doesn't even realize what the hell has happened. But when he wakes up, he realizes that like this huge tragedy has befallen all of them. Nothing he can do to stop it. So he gets really twisted up, and he becomes this monstrous creation himself. And I actually had him as not just a bronze dragon, but a shadow bronze dragon. And he's sort of living and feasting off of the shadows of the souls of others, kind of always kind of trying to like draw in the life that he's missing, and this kind of lost, this lost heritage of his. And so I found his story really compelling, and it was actually really tied up with the whole family. And I found these two domains kind of like rivals with each other, but like there's a possibility that Ramya could reconnect with Sartek, and will Sartek and Ramya be allied? Will they be enemies? There's a lot of questions there, but a lot of campaign or adventure potential.
I have a question before for you. So these two adventures are based on different methodologies from different parts of the world. I personally like to make, if I'm playing in a different setting or a different time period, that I try not to be as offensive. I try to stay with any like stereotypes and things like that. What would you recommend? Is there anything that game masters and players can do to avoid doing anything that may be considered offensive culturally?
Yes. So there's like a category of do's and like a categories of like, ooh, maybe don't do, right? When you are dealing with a made up or a foreign culture based off of real world analogs, which almost everything is, the best approach is to think about the values that culture has. So does that culture value honor? Does that culture value truth? Does that culture value power? And when you roleplay NPCs, you roleplay them with those values, and they react to the player characters by interpreting like through the lens of those values, right? That's one of the most solid ways that you can do these things. And also, I want to encourage every player and GM out there to try this, to do this, to experiment. You don't have to get it right every time, but you gain those muscles and those confidence by like giving it a shot, right? In the maybe don't do category, accents. So some accents are really fun, right? They're based off of personality, but an accent based off of a cultural stereotype is a really bad route to try to go. And I really would not suggest it. That almost always becomes a caricature. And that caricature is usually pretty like toxic, because you're just grabbing like the first thing on top of, what exists. And that's usually a really Western interpretation of somebody else's values that has been put through our frame, and thus is not even remotely true anyway.
I think actually Strix captured pretty much everything I was going to say, is that, try to take the place from where it is, as opposed to putting your own preconceptions of it, or your own like, oh, in my culture I do this and I'm just going to transplant it to that culture. Try to take the culture from where it is and kind of engage with it in that way. But ultimately, also we're having, we're playing a game where we're playing. The key is to have fun and to play in good faith in that regard. So it's D&D. I think we should just have a positive mindset and kind of play to the text.
Are there any plans to continue to explore Valachan or Kalakeri?
I cannot comment.
I think down the road, there's always that potential of future adventures. I definitely know I want to play an adventure in Valachan because I think your domain is the only domain where like the players could potentially be the Dark Lord at the end of like an adventure.
It is true.
Right?
That is an option.
It's pretty amazing in that regard. I think you do something really fun and weird and different that way. So I definitely want to play an adventure in Valachan. But we don't have anything officially on the, but we can talk about at this moment. But I think I would be happy to see both pieces out in the world again.
Is there anything you want to share that I haven't asked you about?
So I have an anecdote that I want to share, and that is there's resources in the book that help you play horror games well. And one resource that I hope people don't sleep on is the X card. And the X card is basically a tool to use when you say, this is making me too uncomfortable, or this doesn't really belong. Like, why is Star Trek in my medieval fantasy, right? What the X card actually allows you to do is push deeper into the horror, actually to make it more scary, because you have a means to communicate where the boundaries are, which means you can push right against them and trust your players and trust your GM to like keep that on the rails so it doesn't become a bad experience. We play games because they're fun. Horror is fun. And if we're not having fun, that's when I think that we're not doing the experience correctly, right? There's no right way to play RPGs, but if you're having a miserable time, you probably want to change what you're doing. Horror in tabletop is a unique thing, right? Bluebeard's Bride is a horrifying game, like capital H, and we got to do that because we had tools that allowed us to get there. And so if you really want the spookiest of the spooky, get practice using the X card, and you can go almost anywhere you want to go.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point in that, I'm not sure about you, Manny, but I know both Strix and I at different times have been like at a table and it's with like a GM that we don't know and we don't maybe know the other players. And we're like, oh, weird. We're like, we're in this really strange scenario. And like, there's no way, you can always be like, oh, I don't really like this content. But like, if the player agreement is something different, or the DM's like, well, this is just the adventure I made and we're just going to do it this way. You're kind of in a weird place. And you're like, okay, well, I don't really want to explore a lot here because I don't really trust everybody else at the table. And I think what the great thing about the X card is like, oh, cool. This is just this agreement that we can go and say, if this is not a comfortable topic, we can stop, which allows us to go be like much more free with the other people at the table. I actually feel much more comfortable be like, oh, I can take a lot of risks at the table and it's okay for me to take a risk because you will tell me if you don't like it by just hitting this X card. And this is the agreement that all of us have made with each other. And I think that's really cool and powerful. So I think that it's really great that the book kind of previewed that or showed that as a tool. I think the other thing is just sort of one of the fun things about the book is D&D is so used to, I'm a lifelong D&D player from the old school red box, D&D basic. And most of D&D content is really set up for the players to be heroes and be victorious in all such scenarios and situations. And Ravenloft is so genuinely different in that it is horror. And I think that was one of the real strong reasons that Wes Snyder, the game designer, was like, hey, I'm not going to put the stat blocks for the Dark Lords because the point of this game is not for you to be like, oh, I'm going to go through the dungeon and beat the big bad. There's tons of other official material out there. If you think about the horror genre and you think about horror movies and horror books, usually things end badly for everybody involved. And part of like the power and magic of Ravenloft is to like, you realize you're there for the journey and that experience of horror and where things can go terribly bad. By statting the big bad at the end, it sort of defeats it because when you put a stat for a monster, you're inviting the players to come up with this really super cunning way that they outwit you and finally defeat the monster. And you're like, okay, well, I guess that wasn't so much of a horror. You kind of just defeated the big dragon at the end of it, and that could be like any other D&D adventure. And so Ravenloft does a lot of things of defying expectations and really allowing and trusting the players and trusting the DM to understand that, you know. And I think that's one of the things I really love about this book. It's really smartly designed and a very specific experience.
I'm really glad you said about the stat box thing, because that was probably one of the few things I was like, oh, I'm surprised there's no, the big bad stats for that. And I was always wondering, like, why did they not have that? Makes perfect sense, and and all, like, especially 80s horror films, like, or 70s also, that bad guys always usually win at the end. How many times, right? This Freddy Krueger.
Yes. Do you remember Pumpkinhead? Pumpkinhead is one of my favorites. I have the action figure.
That's a terrifying movie. I remember that. I was too young to watch that.
That's totally about perpetuating violence, right? And the cursed cycle. Anyway, go watch Pumpkinhead, folks.
But I totally agree. I think people tend to forget that horror is has a very broad umbrella. What may be scary for you may not be scary for me. What may be horrifying for me may not be horrifying for you. Like, I know one person who loves Supernatural, but will not watch the episode with the serial killers, because to her, those are real monsters. I know people that don't like body horror, for example. So yeah, I think that, especially if you're a new game master, you're gonna do horror for the first time. It's very important that horror could be really bothersome to people, and you want your game to be successful to your players. You want them to have a good time. Yeah. So yes. Our viewers out there, definitely check out that section in Ravenloft about that. So it's a good resource, a good tool. Even old GMs like me, it's always good to have and know these things, especially if you're at a convention playing with people you never played with before. But we could do a whole video, video about that.
It's been a pleasure being on here, and if your viewers end up playing in Kalakeri or Valachan, reach out to us on social media. We're both active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is my first name, Ajit George, SB. So just look me up, and I would love to hear about people's play reports and how they're enjoying the playing in Kalakeri.
Agreed. You can find me on Twitter at the Strix, _STIX. I talk a lot of narrative design about games on the regular. So if you want more insight into how narrative RPGs are made, definitely follow along.
Awesome. I will put the social media links on the description below. Thank you both for taking the time to talk to us about this. And to our viewers out there, be safe, get your shots, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day.